It is 1943, and the Columbia River is running cold. Somewhere in the vast, wind-scraped basin of south-central Washington state, in a stretch of high desert so remote that most Americans had never heard its name, something extraordinary is being buried. Not metaphorically, not bureaucratically, literally buried beneath layers of concrete, secrecy, and officially sanctioned silence so deep that the full truth would not begin to surface for more than 7 decades. The land is called the Hanford site, and what was built beneath its cracked, sage-dotted earth would change the world and poison it in ways the government would spend generations trying to hide. Most people have heard fragments, a name here, a Cold War reference there. But in January of 2026, a tranche of documents declassified by the Department of Energy finally closed the last gap in a story that had been carefully, deliberately incomplete. What those files confirmed about the construction, the human exposure, the deliberate contamination releases, and the active concealment that followed the war transforms what was already a remarkable chapter of history into something closer to a ghost story told in plutonium and paperwork. This is not a story about heroism, though there was heroism here. It is a story about what a government will do when it believes the stakes are high enough, and what it will bury when things go wrong. To understand what happened at Hanford, you first have to understand the scale of what America launched in 1942 under the name the Manhattan Project. By the time the program reached full operation, it was not a laboratory experiment or a research initiative. It was an industrial civilization, conjured from nothing, hidden inside the geography of a continent, more than 30 sites scattered across 13 states, secret cities that did not appear on any map. A workforce eventually numbering over 130,000 people, many of whom had no idea what they were building, what it would do, or what it was already doing to their bodies. The government's fear in those early years was not abstract. German physicists were brilliant. The Nazi regime had access to heavy water facilities in occupied Norway. British intelligence was reporting disturbing advances. Washington's leadership, from Roosevelt downward, genuinely believed that if Germany achieved nuclear capability before the Allies did, the war, and perhaps Western civilization, was finished. That fear became a mandate, and that mandate became a machine so vast, so hungry for resources and secrecy, that it developed its own momentum, its own logic, and eventually its own capacity for darkness. The site selected in Washington state was chosen with ruthless precision. The Columbia River provided enormous volumes of cold, clean water, essential for reactor cooling. The surrounding desert provided isolation. The nearest city of any size, Richland, was small enough to be quietly absorbed into the project's control. The federal government did not ask for the land. It took it, invoking wartime powers to relocate approximately 1,500 residents, most of them farmers and indigenous community members, with minimal notice and minimal compensation. One government memo from that period, recently made available in full, describes the displacement as operationally necessary and strategically non-negotiable. The people who had lived on that land for generations were given weeks to leave. They were not told why. What replaced them defied imagination. Within 18 months, the Hanford site grew to encompass over 580 square miles, an area roughly the size of Los Angeles. At the height of construction, 50,000 workers were on site simultaneously. 9 nuclear reactors would eventually be built along the Columbia. Massive chemical separation plants rose from the desert floor. Underground storage tanks, some of them 1 million gallons in capacity, and were excavated and sealed beneath the surface like buried cathedrals. The federal government spent, in 1940s dollars, what would today amount to tens of billions, and almost none of it was visible from any public road. Construction at Hanford was an exercise in industrial theater. Workers were recruited aggressively from across the country, drawn by wages higher than almost anything available in wartime civilian life. They arrived to find an enormous tent city, later replaced by prefabricated barracks, on the edge of nowhere. They were assigned identification numbers rather than names on certain documents. They were told they were building a war production facility and instructed in orientation sessions never to discuss their work outside the site perimeter. Most of them had no idea they were standing at the center of humanity's most consequential technological program. The reactors themselves were engineering achievements of staggering ambition. The B reactor, the first to reach operational status in September of 1944, was a hulking graphite structure cooled by the Columbia's water pumped through thousands of aluminum tubes. It ran on natural uranium, triggering a controlled fission chain reaction that converted that uranium into something that had barely existed on Earth before, plutonium. This was the material that would eventually be assembled into the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Workers who loaded and unloaded the uranium fuel rods wore rudimentary dosimetry badges that, declassified records now show, frequently registered readings that supervisors were instructed to round down rather than report accurately. The phrase used internally, recovered in the 2026 document release, was administratively adjusted. Life inside the facilities had a surreal, pressurized quality that survivors would spend decades trying to articulate. Shifts ran around the clock, the reactors never stopped, the chemical separation canyons, enormous reinforced concrete structures so thick that remote-controlled equipment had to be used inside them because human exposure to the radiation levels present was deemed unsurvivable for any extended period, operated continuously, processing irradiated fuel into weapons-grade plutonium. Workers in adjacent areas were separated from those environments by walls and procedures, but the borders between safe and unsafe zones were, in the early years, less clearly defined than the official history suggested. But there was a problem. Several problems, in fact, each one more troubling than the last. The first was contamination. The chemical separation process generated enormous quantities of radioactive liquid waste. In the early years of operation, a significant portion of this waste was not stored. It was discharged directly into the soil, directly into the Columbia River. The volumes involved were not accidental spillage. They were deliberate operational decisions made by engineers and approved by managers who calculated that the river's flow would dilute the contamination to levels they considered acceptable. What they did not fully calculate, or did not choose to consider, was the bioaccumulation of radioactive isotopes in fish, in river sediment, in the food chain of indigenous communities along the Columbia, who had been eating salmon from that river for 10,000 years. What they discovered next was even more disturbing. Internal monitoring data from the mid-1940s, portions of which were classified until very recently, shows that contamination plumes in the groundwater beneath the site were moving faster and spreading further than any early model had predicted. Radioactive iodine, strontium, and tritium were detected at monitoring points miles from the reactors. Some of those points were not far from residential areas. The response, documented in memoranda that would not see public light for decades, was not to halt or reduce operations. It was to classify the monitoring data and instruct personnel with knowledge of it that the information constituted a matter of national security. This was not incompetence. The records reveal a structured, deliberate decision to prioritize weapons production over what internal documents occasionally acknowledged were potential public health implications. One particularly stark exchange, recovered in the January 2026 release, shows a senior Hanford official asking whether nearby communities should be warned about elevated radioactive iodine levels detected in local milk supplies. The response from a Washington official in writing was a single sentence: the matter was not appropriate for civilian communication at this time. The cover-up, if that word is adequate to describe something so systematic, was not the work of villains in the cinematic sense. It was the work of rational people who had been given an overwhelming mandate and told that the alternative to secrecy was catastrophe. They believed it. Many of them were right that the war was real, that the stakes were genuine, that the bomb mattered. But belief in a mission, however legitimate, does not immunize a bureaucracy from the consequences of what it hides. And what Hanford hid was extensive. There was the Green Run. In December of 1949, after the war was over, after the bombs had fallen, after the justification of wartime urgency had dissolved, the Atomic Energy Commission deliberately released a large quantity of radioactive material into the atmosphere above Hanford. The The stated purpose was to test whether American monitoring equipment could detect Soviet nuclear activity by tracking atmospheric signatures. The release was intentional. The surrounding population was not informed. Downwinder communities in eastern Washington and northern Idaho received doses of radioactive iodine that later epidemiological studies would suggest correlated with elevated rates of thyroid cancer. The Green Run remained classified for decades. When it was finally acknowledged, the official characterization was careful and minimal. The 2026 documents add layers to this story that are considerably harder to characterize as minimal. After 1945, the site did not wind down. If anything, it accelerated. The Cold War replaced the Second World War as the justification, and the reactors at Hanford continued producing plutonium for an expanding American nuclear arsenal throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. The last of the original production reactors was finally shut down in 1971. But shutting down a reactor is not the same as making it safe, and making it safe is not the same as cleaning it up. The Hanford site entered a long, agonizing twilight, no longer actively producing weapons material, but containing within its soil and its tanks and its buried structures a volume of radioactive and chemical waste that the Department of Energy would eventually describe as the most contaminated nuclear site in the Western Hemisphere. The underground storage tanks, some of them dating to the 1940s, became the site's most urgent and most intractable problem. By the time serious cleanup efforts began in the 1980s, a significant number of those tanks were leaking, not slowly, not in trace amounts. The 2026 document release confirmed what whistleblowers had alleged for years. Internal assessments from the 1970s and 1980s showing known leakage rates were classified or suppressed, and public statements about tank integrity made by agency officials during the same period were, in the language of the newly released files, inconsistent with internal assessments. The contamination plume in the groundwater is still moving. It is moving toward the Columbia River. Government estimates place the timeline for that plume reaching the river in the coming decades, though independent scientists have suggested the timeline may be optimistic. Remediation efforts, a project now estimated to cost over $100 billion and to last until at least 2060, continue on the site. Workers there today encounter conditions their predecessors created and recorded and then buried. Some of what they encounter was not in any file they were given. Some of it surfaces without warning. There have been reports, not officially acknowledged but documented in worker testimonies compiled by advocacy groups over the past 20 years, of areas within the Hanford Reservation where monitoring instruments behave unexpectedly, where readings spike without apparent cause, where older infrastructure, thought sealed and stable, shows signs of continued thermal activity. These reports are difficult to verify precisely because the site remains, in many of its older sections, inadequately mapped. The 2026 disclosures confirm that certain areas of the site constructed under wartime secrecy protocols were never fully documented in any central record system. There are structures beneath the Hanford Desert for which no complete engineering drawing exists in any accessible archive. What happened to Washington State's secret underground nuclear reactor is not a story with a clean ending, because the story is not over. The reactors themselves, 8 of the 9 original production reactors, have been cocooned, encased in their decaying structures, and left for a future when the radiation levels will have dropped enough to allow proper decommissioning. The B reactor is now a national historic landmark, open for tours by appointment, its vast graphite core still faintly radioactive, its control room preserved in the particular amber of a moment when the world changed, and most of the world did not know it. Standing in that reactor hall today, you can hear the wind moving through the structure. You can see where the hands of workers left marks in the concrete. You can feel the weight of what was made here, and what was hidden, and what was never fully accounted for. The downwinders, the communities of eastern Washington and northern Idaho and Oregon, who lived in the shadow of Hanford's releases for decades, have spent years fighting for acknowledgement that their elevated cancer rates, their thyroid diseases, their children's illnesses were not coincidences. Some have received partial settlements. None have received what they might reasonably call justice. The full picture of their exposure has never been publicly assembled in one place, because the full picture was never assembled in one place internally, and because what was assembled was not always preserved, and was sometimes, the 2026 documents confirm, deliberately fragmented to prevent any single person from seeing the whole. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over the Hanford Plateau in the evening, when the light goes flat and the sage goes gray, and the Columbia catches the last of the western sky. It is a silence that feels old and layered, as if the desert remembers what was done here even when the paperwork does not. The rusted infrastructure of the older reactor buildings creaks in the wind. The groundwater moves slowly beneath everything, and somewhere in the soil, in the sediment, in the half-lives of isotopes that will outlast every institution that created them, the legacy of what was built here in secret continues its patient, invisible work. The government has admitted a great deal about Hanford over the past 30 years. The 2026 documents have forced it to admit considerably more. But admission is not revelation, and revelation is not completeness. Every archive has a backroom. Every declassification leaves a remainder. We only know about the ones they admitted. What about the ones still hidden?